This podcast is sponsored by Demode Records. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Wright. Today, we are interviewing Richard Wright. This is part 1 of 3 of this podcast.
Hi, I'm Richard Wright. I'm really currently retired, although I'm a part-time author. I used to work for the European Union. I worked there for 33 years, and I worked subsequently for 5 years for UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees in New York. Essentially spent most of my life on working in diplomacy and international affairs. I was the EU ambassador in Russia, also on the committee, the Political Security Committee, which prepared EU foreign ministers meetings for about 5 or 6 years as well. So very interesting life, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Richard, what do you feel you achieved in 5 years as someone who's running UNRWA?
Well, I wasn't running UNRWA, just to be clear. I was the representative of the agency in New York, essentially attached to the United Nations. So the job essentially was to fundraise for UNRWA. That was one part of it, to communicate UNRWA's views to the General Assembly, to member states, to the heads of the United Nations agencies, and to be present, because there are many meetings and conferences and things of relevance to UNRWA's work. The Middle East in general, the Israel-Palestine issue in particular are very much, I would say, key issues in the context of the United Nations.
Can you tell us a bit about the history of UNRWA?
Yeah. So this is a very important question, and I think something that many people don't really fully understand. So let me go back exactly to the origin of UNRWA. So in 1948-49, there was obviously a conflict in Palestine, and as a result of that conflict, Israel emerged as a state. But in doing so, there were very large numbers of people, Palestinians essentially, who were evicted from their what was essentially their homes and their livelihoods. Now, these were a very large number of people. About 750,000 people literally were forced out as a result of this conflict. Now, this created an immediate humanitarian problem and led to the creation of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, to give it its correct title. Now, this agency actually predated UNHCR, the agency dealing with other refugee questions, by approximately 1 year. So it's a rather unique and unusual body. So the immediate challenge was, these people, 750,000 people, had to be given humanitarian assistance. And I think the assumption always was that this was a temporary agency. It was not going to last for a long time. It was just there to, help and provide services for the people who've left, who've been forced out, until they were able to return home. But of course, that's never happened. And this 750,000 people was spread over 5 areas: the Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, and which is still the case, with the largest number in Jordan, and also very large numbers in Gaza and the West Bank, and smaller numbers in Lebanon, and a fairly sizable population in Syria. But of course, the 750,000 people who were initially expelled are now roughly 6.5 million. This is the size of the population of Norway. So if you imagine, it's if you like, a group of people without a state. Living in this area. So this was the start. Now, what does UNRWA do? UNRWA is not a traditional provider of humanitarian assistance in the sense of Oxfam or other NGOs. It provides, the core mission of UNRWA was to provide humanitarian development, which is essentially education and health. But also, because there are many impoverished refugees, they also provide humanitarian assistance and cash support and training, this type of thing. But the bulk of it, the core of it today is education and health, which eats up approximately, if I recall, about 90% of the UNRWA budget. So that's basically in a snapshot. Now, you know, the problem is that this so-called temporary agency has now become quasi-permanent. Its mandate under the United Nations is renewed every 3 years. It was last renewed last December, if I recall correctly, by a vote in the United Nations General Assembly. So the agency reports it reports regularly to the United Nations General Assembly, which authorizes it. It's funded through voluntary contributions by member states of the United Nations. And this is an important point because, of course, this is very precarious. I mean, if states choose not to fund it or choose to withdraw funds, its situation becomes extremely difficult. And this is certainly the situation now. For example, the United States, traditionally the largest donor, provides nothing these days. Even Sweden, a country that was a very traditional donor and a generous donor for many years, is no longer providing assistance. So the financial situation of the agency, which was always very wobbly, is now even more precarious than it has been in past years. But the underlying issue has not been solved, which is what happens to these refugees. Is there going to be a state in which they can call their own? So no political outcome, no political settlement has been concluded as a result of what happened back in almost 70, 80 years ago almost now, along with all the other issues in relation to Israel-Palestine. But this is one of the core, let's say 6, 7 issues which, if there is to be a settlement between Israel and Palestine, that this has to be a key part. What happens to these people? Because under the United Nations, they have a so-called right of return to their homes. In the past, of course, this is something that Israel would never accept. But it remains a UN resolution which is on the statute book, so to speak, to which many Palestinians still attach great importance.
There are also many movements across the world alongside all the issues that are now supporting the Palestinian issue. Did you have regular contact with these organizations like the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and all of them?
No,
they take an interest?
The one thing I am doing, I'm part of a group within the European Union that wants to see the European Union take a more robust stance on these matters. That's all really I'm directly engaged with. And I do follow the issue very closely because, like many other people who work in this sphere, it sort of becomes part of you because it's such a hugely important question. And, I think pretty much everyone certainly in theory anyway, believes that the only solution to this intractable problem is 2 states. Now, this is the traditional Western view, if you like. Many people, perhaps today, would argue it's no longer feasible. But, nobody really comes up with an alternative. I mean, 1 state to me is not really an alternative at all because it probably lead to the domination of one side over the other, or absorption of Palestinians within an enlarged Israeli state, or even worst of all would be the expulsion of Palestinians from their traditional lands. So I don't think there's any real alternative to these 2 states. But The reality today is it seems a very, very long way, even further away than it was in the past.
Can you tell us a bit about I was going to ask about the typical budgets we're talking about. I'm assuming that since 48 to now, the budgets have increased enormously, as has the population. What kind of budgets and what kind of responsibilities?
Yeah, I don't have the figures with me, but my recollection is it's in the order of $1.2 to $1.4 billion. But I mean, this is pretty small when you take the size of the overall population. And remember, that what is this money spent on? It's spent on staff salaries. So UNRWA, as a whole, employs about 30,000 people, right, throughout the 5 regions, and that so that money pays the staff, the teachers, right, which I think are about 22,000 of the 30,000, the medical workers, doctors, etc. That's what the money is spent on. A little bit for infrastructure works, camp improvement, this type of thing, but it's small. You know, the vast bulk of it is the salaries for the people who are teaching the children, and the medical services. And it's not, you know, it's not fully fledged hospitals. It's primary medical care, like clinics we have in this country. So that's what happened. Now, as I said, apart from a very, very small amount taken from the UN's overall budget, which essentially pays for the staff, the salaries of the international staff, of which I was one, all the rest of it comes from voluntary contributions, and traditionally from Western countries mainly. Now, you know, there are bigger contributions now from some Arab countries, Gulf countries, and as I mentioned, some Western former Western partners have dropped out completely. So the agency has always been in a very tight financial situation. Certainly when I was there. But now it's really very critical.
When you were working at UNRWA, did you meet the leaders of both Israel and Palestine at the time? And what was your recollection?
I participated in 1 or 2 meetings with Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, and I also had I was essentially sitting in on a meeting that was held between the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was visiting the United Nations for the General Assembly, only once.
What was your impression?
No, I mean, I think, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu is a forthright individual. He's got very strong views. That certainly came across in the meeting. I don't have any recollection of the details of it. It was certainly more than 10 years ago now. And Mahmoud Abbas is a very welcoming person. Obviously, for the Palestinians, UNRWA is a key agency for them, and takes care of a very large number of Palestinians. Not all Palestinians, by the way, fall under the framework of UNRWA. The criterion in the past was, or the criterion is you had to have lost home and livelihood as a result of the conflict in 48, 49, and subsequent descendants, and this has always been a controversial point amongst certain Israeli commentators who say, well, these people are not refugees at all, but they are under international law, and they are under the rules which UNRWA operates. So you don't cease becoming a refugee if the refugee status of your family or your parents is unchanged. And this is the same for UNHCR, which deals with all the other refugee situations in the world. The difference being that UNHCR actually has a mandate to try and find solutions to the problems of the refugees. The distinguishing feature of UNRWA, which came before UNHCR, is that it has no so-called political mandate. It's not UNRWA's job to try and find a solution to the problem of all these refugees. That's part of the political process, one of many sort of intractable issues that have yet to be solved. So that was a distinguishing factor.
Did you manage to go on the ground? Did you visit all the refugee camps? Did you visit Israel? Did you listen to other people's opinions? Did your views change? Could you do anything, or did you have to focus on the remit of the agency? Did you have any influence on a personal level?
No, I think I think being realistic, you had to focus on the remit of the agency. But I did go. I was in Gaza 3 or 4 times. Last time was about 2016, so more than 10 years ago. And I visited also Syria. I mean, in the fairly early days of the Syrian civil war, where the Palestinian communities were refugee communities were quite badly impacted. And also, I've been to all the areas. Probably the area where the Palestine refugees are least well treated has been in the Lebanon. Where, frankly speaking, they're not as well integrated, and there's a lot of tensions there. I think one's ability as a member of, reasonably senior member of the UNRWA to have an individual impact is somewhat limited. I mean, our main goal, as I said, certainly from where I was in New York, was to fundraise, to support UNRWA, to make sure that issues affecting the United Nations, that they took into account UNRWA's views.
What was your impression on the ground? Did you speak to the locals? Did you speak to the locals when you were in? Course, yeah. What did they tell you? Well, do you remember any stories?
No, I think, look, I mean, just to speak about Gaza, I have to say I was generally very impressed with the quality of the schooling that UNRWA was providing. That's just schooling up to about age 15, 16 or so, and certainly a very strong willingness on the part of children to learn. Now, children in Gaza, the frontiers are not open there. They're basically consigned to where this small area of a geographical area where they were living. But there was a very strong commitment, and also in providing health service. So people got on with their lives. People are going to do this wherever they are. They make the best of it. But it's, they're essentially very poor. Now I met also, there was some travel scholarships for Palestinian refugees who came to New York to learn things. For example, journalists. And I certainly I met a lot of people in refugee camps and talk to them and try to listen to where their problems. But I mean, one overriding, pervading image is that most of them are very extremely poor. They sort of live, many of them, hand to mouth, but they do give great importance to education for the children, and I think this is borne out by the very good evaluation of UNRWA education programs, which follows the Palestinian ones. And in addition, UNRWA has provided human rights training as part of this. So, I mean, those are some of the pressures, but I mean, I think for people, let's say, who went to Gaza now has obviously been very largely destroyed, so the situation's far worse. But I mean, the will to live, the desire to learn, the desire to hopefully have a better life one day, I think is very strong in the Palestinian communities.
On both sides, did you encounter extremist sort of ideological aggression on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side?
Not really, no, because that wasn't part of my mandate. But I didn't do that on either side. So I never met any people from Hamas, for example, or from say more right-wing groups in Israel. I mean, those official UNRWA staff on the ground in Gaza also have very limited contacts, but have to have some contacts nonetheless with administrative authorities in order to be able to carry out their work. For example, pay electricity bills or fix roads or whatever. But UNRWA is not a political organisation, and was steered very carefully and clear from getting involved in political matters.
Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lippman. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch. This podcast is sponsored by Demode Records.